Let's discuss the I don't want my peas to touch your mashed potatoes version of heathenry. I see this a lot on the subreddit and in heathen spaces in general, where people think that the Galdrastafir are Christian or are touched or infected by Christianity, therefore it is invalid to use. This discounts any inclination of what folk magic, folk practice, folk religion is. Unfortunately, the word folk has been taken by folkists, the bigots in heathenry, to mean something racist. That is not the intention of what folk practice is. Folk practice is just like the practice of the common people. Again, it's unfortunate that that word has been co-opted by bigots and may have even named a certain German car company. So when it comes to conversion, there's never really like a hard line, a flip the switch. Now all of a sudden we're Christians and we can just get rid of all that pagan shit. No, people don't work that way. People do not transition that hard line, that black and white, right? They don't just flip that way. There will always be elements of the previous culture. It will change into something new. It will look different, but the previous culture will still have an element, shadows within that new overculture. That being said, the overculture itself, the status quo, the ownership class, the landed gentry, what we would consider bourgeoisie today, those are the people that probably converted the hardest, the fastest, and the most. And we have evidence of state violence imposed upon formerly polytheist people in order to mandate through the state conversion to the new religion. They would not need to create laws, i.e. state violence, if it was just like a quick changeover. If the people just changed and it was fine. Religious freedom wasn't even a thing in Iceland until the 1870s. And about 100 years later, the Ásatrúarfélagið was founded, and that's kind of where we get contemporary Ásatrú as a concept. So the medieval grimoire that we get the Galdrastafir from, that was a trend in Europe. We see it with the Solomonic magic, with the Goetia, which was not actually written by Solomon. He died hundreds of years before that thing was ever penned. It was a popular theme at the time to use historical figures as pen names. And that era of medieval manuscripts is kind of a proto-era for 1800s spiritualism, and that is a precursor to the contemporary pagan movements that you see in like the 50s, 60s, and 70s. There's kind of a line of an evolution out of the conversion era, kind of getting back to the old ways. Not an unbroken line, mind you, a very diluted line, a lot of like guessing, a lot of bad history, but that's a topic for another video. So what is a folk practice? A folk practice is the practice of the common people. We see this with Haitian voodoo. We see this with Señor la Muerte and Santa Muerte worship. With voodoo, we get Yoruba polytheism. So Yoruba is the largest ethnic group in Africa. They're in West Africa, where a lot of the slaves were stolen from. Their polytheism intermingled with the overculture of the slavers, Catholicism. And that's why voodoo is a blend of Catholicism and Yorubic polytheism, which was actually integral in the Haitian rebellion. So with Santa Muerte and Señor la Muerte, those come from earlier indigenous practices. You have Mexicans, which is the actual name for Aztecs, Mayans, all of those cultures. Death cultus was very important and very popular in those cultures. We see a large focus on their death gods, large focus on their afterlife. And in the book Liber Foxifer, it actually mentions that, the origins of Señor la Muerte, because it focuses on that. Essentially, their death god turned into the Grim Reaper, right? It synchronized. And in the modern day, Santa Muerte and Señor la Muerte are very popular with people that are not seen as desirable, quote unquote, by the mainstream Catholic Church, by the colonizing religion that has taken over those areas. A lot of the worshippers, they still consider themselves Catholic. They see this Grim Reaper figure as a saint, but it is not recognized by the mainstream Catholic religion. They see it as heresy. Similar to the Galdrastafir. Well, there's not any direct evidence of Galdrastafir being in pre-Christian times. Galdr as a concept means spell, right? So Galdr means spell, a chant, yell, incantation. And there is a poetic meter called Galdralag. Galdralag is very repetitive. It'll have multiple alliterations. I go over this in my runes video where I actually read the poems and stuff. And now we do have older amulets that are pre-Christian that show multiple runes, right? Multiple letters, repetitive, and we have no idea what they mean. It could reference that older Galdr practice. So with all that, we see that most likely Galdrastafir is a folk magic that comes from an older practice, that comes from a pre-Christian practice that was practiced by the common people. Your working class people, right? Your Carl class. Those were the people that kept these things alive, though it did change. So while Galdrastafir itself is not a previous pagan practice, it likely descends from earlier pagan practices. While it is not pagan, it is Nordic. It is specifically Icelandic, in fact. And of course, it's perfectly acceptable to add that to your gnosis. There's nothing wrong with adding the Galdrastafir, the Icelandic staves, to your practice. The people that don't want their peas to touch their mashed potatoes are being reactionary. They are reacting to this contemporary idea that Christianity is just evil, it is just the bad one, when in reality, it's also not that clear. It also has a long history of being manipulated by the aristocracy, by the ownership class, like stemming from like Theodosius I, who literally sacked pagan temples that were previously, part of the Roman state, like not too long before that, inciting mobs that actually pulled priests out of these temples and murdered them. But the common people, the working class people, they were not the ones imposing that state violence. Christianity famously takes a lot from paganism, right? From these earlier polytheist traditions. And in fact, I was just watching a Dan McClellan video where he was going over how the Hebrew Bible does not explicitly mention monotheism. That is a modern read of it. First Temple Judaism has elements of the Canaanite polytheism that came before. Canaanite polytheism has like El is your sky god, Baal is your thunder god. El gets god status, Baal gets demon status. So even Christianity itself stems from an earlier polytheist practice and has elements of those folk practices. So to surmise, it is perfectly okay to use Galdrastafir in your personal gnosis as part of your heathenry. There's nothing wrong with it. It is simply this strange heathen puritanical view that doesn't want the peas and the mashed potatoes to intersect. So with all that, I hope that helps. For more information, please watch my rune video. It's in multiple sections on TikTok. It is one large video on YouTube. I have a bunch of sources in there if you want more information. Research, follow those rabbit holes, and eventually you too can be a jackass on the internet.